The world is still. A cruel, endless silence blankets the steppe. Frost clings to the armor of fallen riders. Horses lie frozen mid-stride, eyes glazed, breath turned to crystal. The wind howls across a plain littered with banners torn and buried beneath the snow. For decades, they were death on horseback, shadows that burned the world awake. Cities crumbled at their sight. Kingdoms prayed, and priests rang bells that could not save them. They came like storms, precise, merciless, unending. No fortristuth. No mercy was given. The very word Mongol became a prayer whispered only to the dead. But then, one winter night, in a world that had long forgotten hope, the riders stopped. The crack of ice under hooves, the groan of wind through dying forests, a single arrow dropping harmlessly into snow. Something changed. The hunters became the hunted. What followed was not a battle of swords, but of silence. Not conquest by kings, but by hunger, disease, and the cold hands of a world that refused to yield. As Europe bled and burned, it also learned. It learned to wait. It learned to endure. And in the heart of winter, it learned how to kill the invincible. This is the story of how the conquerors who feared no man were undone by the very land they sought to rule. If you're new to Cursed Chronicles, stay with us. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This story crosses continents and centuries, and the echoes of it still haunt our world today. They called it the Age of Fear, a time when the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath the hooves of the East. The year was 1241, and the sky over Europe burned red with omens. From the frozen plains of Russia to the forests of Poland and Hungary, whispers turned into screams. The Mongols had come. No one had ever seen such war. They moved like smoke, silent until the moment they struck. At Legnica, in the heart of Poland, entire armies were swallowed whole. Knights in shining armor, men who believed faith could shield them, found themselves cut down before their swords even left their scabbards. The Polish banners, once proud against the wind, fell one by one into mud and ash. Further south, on the banks of the Sajo River, came the Battle of Mohi. It was supposed to be Hungary's stand, a nation's last prayer. But prayers die quickly under thunder. The Mongols encircled the camp at night, and by morning, there was no army left to pray. The river ran dark for days. Survivors spoke of arrows that blotted out the sun, of riders who appeared and vanished like ghosts. To them, this was not an army, it was the end of the world made flesh. In the months that followed, stories spread faster than truth. Monks claimed the Mongols drank the blood of their victims. Traders whispered that they were demons, invincible, inhuman, sent by God's wrath to scour the sinful earth. Whole villages fled at the mere rumor of hoofbeats. Europe had seen war before, but never something that unmade courage itself. And yet, even as kingdoms broke and thrones trembled, the Mongols suddenly stopped. Their camps emptied. Their fires went cold. One day, the horizon was full of riders, and the next it was empty. No one understood why. Some called it a miracle. Others said the angels had intervened. But the truth was stranger, quieter. The great Khan Ogdi had died far away in Mongolia, and the generals turned back to decide the empire's fate. It was not Europe's victory. It was Europe's reprieve. And that reprieve became a lesson. In cathedrals and fortresses, men began to study what had nearly destroyed them. They dissected the Mongol mind, their formations, their horses, their signals. They watched, waited, learned. Across the continent, blacksmiths reforged swords, architects strengthened walls, and kings who once warred with each other began whispering of unity. Fear had not destroyed Europe. It had sharpened it. The Mongols had vanished beyond the horizon, but they left behind a continent that no longer prayed for mercy. It was now preparing, quietly, methodically, vengefully. If you've ever wondered how terror can teach survival, click like, and let more souls discover the forgotten moments that reshaped the world. Tell me where you're watching from, because this story, like all curses, still echoes far beyond its time. Would you like me to continue directly with the next sequence? 3. Europe strikes back, the walls that wouldn't fall. In this same cinematic, haunting tone, the Mongol army was not an army in the way Europe understood it. It was a living organism, fluid, relentless, impossible to catch. Every man was both soldier and scout, every horse both weapon and shield. Their empire did not march, it flowed. Each warrior rode with 5, sometimes 10 horses, changing mounts before exhaustion could touch them. They carried their world with them. Meat dried in the sun, milk turned to curd, bows strung with sinew from the beasts they had slain. They needed no supply lines, no wagons, no kings shouting orders from behind. The steppe had made them all the same, hard, patient, and merciless. They struck where no one expected and vanished before the echo of battle could fade. Villages saw smoke rising on the horizon, but by the time they sent for help, the riders were already gone, leaving behind silence, ashes, and fear. They did not just fight with arrows and swords. They fought with imagination. They sent captives ahead to spread tales of unstoppable wrath, used decoys to make 10,000 look like 100,000. They were masters of deception, turning fear into a weapon sharper than any blade. But even a storm has a heart that can be broken. The same mobility that made them gods of the open plain became their curse when the land itself refused to yield. Their power was bound to grass and wind, to the endless steppe where their horses could graze. In the thick forests and wet fields of Europe, those same horses grew sick. Mud swallowed their hooves, cold rotted their lungs, and the grass that once fed empires turned to frost. The Mongols carried death with them, but they also carried its seeds. Their animals, their camps, their slaughterhouses, all were breeding grounds for unseen enemies. Anthrax, glanders, fevers born of exhaustion. Disease crept through their ranks long before arrows did. The same wind that once carried their banners now carried pestilence. And with each campaign, something else began to change. The legend of their invincibility had become their armor. They believed the world could not touch them. But arrogance is the slowest poison. It kills after the last victory. The Mongols had conquered everything they could see. What they could not see was turning against them. The terrain, the weather, the minds of those they had terrified. Europe began to understand this anatomy of power, the pulse that drove it, the veins that could be severed. It realized it could not outfight the Mongols on open ground. So it decided to erase the ground itself. If this dark unraveling of empires fascinates you, remember to subscribe and join Cursed Chronicles. Like this story if it pulled you into the shadows of history, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because the next turn in this tale will show how the hunted finally learned to strike back. They began by reshaping the very world beneath their feet. Europe, once fractured by pride and faith, started to build not just castles, but fortresses of endurance. Walls thick enough to swallow catapults, moats deep enough to drown cavalry, towns built like traps. The Mongols' greatest weapon was movement. Europe answered with stillness. Stone replaced speed. Iron replaced fear. From the frozen plains of Hungary to the mountain citadels of Transylvania, architects studied the ruins left by Mongol fire and rebuilt them into something new, cold, deliberate, unbreakable. Narrow alleys replaced open fields, forcing riders to dismount. Bridges were rigged to collapse at the first sight of dust on the horizon. Forests were cut and reshaped into barricades that could funnel an entire horde into slaughter. Europe's warriors changed too. Knights once proud of open combat now hid behind walls, waiting for the enemy to come to them. It was no longer about courage. It was about survival through patience, through calculation, through cruelty. The Mongols had taught Europe the art of fear, and now that lesson was turned back upon them. The invaders returned years later, expecting the same terrified kingdoms, but what they found was something colder. Towns that refused to burn. Soldiers who no longer broke at the sound of drums. Messengers who vanished before they could deliver terror. The world they had once outrun was now closing in. Winter became Europe's weapon. The Mongols' horses starved in the snow. Their arrows lost their tension in the damp. The same frost that once preserved their meat now claimed their men. Their armor, perfect for the dry winds of the steppe, grew heavy with ice. Their maps, drawn for open plains, became useless in a land that fought back with rivers and forests. Every campaign that had once lasted months began to stretch into years, and with each passing season, the horde bled, not from swords, but from the slow, invisible war waged by a continent learning to endure. Europe did not defeat the Mongols in a single battle. It defeated them by refusing to die. In the end, it wasn't a clash of kings or a final, glorious battle that decided their fate. It was the slow unmaking of fear itself. The Mongols, once the architects of terror, began to feel the echo of what they had sown. Their scouts vanished into forests that never gave them back. Their horses, once tireless, stumbled in the frozen mud. Every village, every fortress, every river crossing became a trap designed not to win, but to wound. And for the first time in their history, the riders who had swept through continents began to hesitate. The myth of invincibility cracked. One arrow lost in the snow became a symbol of decline. One retreat, one failed siege, one commander who did not return, and suddenly the world realized the Mongols could bleed. Word spread faster than armies. The storm could be stopped. From Poland to Lithuania, from the Balkans to the Carpathians, Europe's resistance became a contagion of defiance. Farmers dug pits along roadsides. Priests turned churches into fortresses. Even nature seemed to conspire. Rains turned plains to swamps. Rivers flooded the paths of retreat. Disease followed in the Mongols' wake. Their empire, so vast it once blotted out the sun, began to devour itself from within. By the time their banners faded from the western horizon, Europe no longer trembled. The terror that had once ridden from the east had become a story, a scar carved into its memory. And scars, though they fade, never forget the blade that made them. This is how the invincible became the hunted, how the tide that once drowned kingdoms was pulled back by the weight of time, cold, and endurance. It wasn't a triumph of strength, but of survival. If stories like this move you, if you feel the chill of history still breathing beneath the soil of forgotten battlefields, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Like this story to help others uncover the ghosts buried in our past, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because the echoes of the Mongol thunder may be gone, but their shadow still lingers in every empire that dares to believe it cannot fall. Even after their retreat, the Mongols' shadow remained. It drifted across Europe like a stain that refused to fade, haunting the imagination of generations. Their devastation had carved more than graves into the land. It had carved memory into blood. In monasteries and royal courts, scholars wrote of the horsemen who came from nowhere, who burned everything, and then vanished like a curse lifted by dawn. They became both legend and warning, their fury woven into the prayers of the fearful and the ambitions of those who studied their fall. For while the Mongols disappeared beyond the steppes, their methods lingered. Europe had watched, learned, and evolved. The tactics once used to destroy it were now being reborn in its own armies. Mobility, reconnaissance, deception. The very tools of the horde became blueprints for future wars. The same Europe that had once hidden behind walls now began to move again, to experiment with warfare that prized speed and strategy over blind valor. The student had inherited the mind of the master. But beneath this transformation lay something darker, admiration laced with fear. Every nation that rebuilt in the Mongols' wake built not only higher walls, but stronger ambitions. They had seen what power could do when untamed, what fear could command when weaponized. And in that realization, the seeds of new empires began to grow. Empires that would one day reach even farther than the Mongols ever had. In their downfall, the Mongols had unknowingly passed on their greatest legacy. The idea that the world could be conquered not by divine right, but by human design. Their empire had burned itself into the psyche of mankind, and the memory of their rise and ruin would whisper through every age that followed, reminding those who dared to rule the world that even the invincible must someday kneel before the cold hand of time. Centuries passed, and yet the echoes of hoofbeats never truly died. In the winds that swept across the plains of Eastern Europe, there was still a whisper of thunder, a memory older than the kingdoms that rose upon those ashes. Travelers spoke of bones found beneath the soil, armor fused by fire, and arrowheads buried deep in the roots of forests that once hid terrified peasants. The Mongols were gone, but their shadow lived on in stories, in bloodlines, in fear itself. The chronicles called them demons. The poets called them destiny. And perhaps both were true. For what the Mongols left behind was not merely destruction, it was transformation. Europe emerged from the ruin harder, more cunning, and more ruthless than before. The terror that once came from the east had been absorbed into its veins. The lessons of endurance, of patience, of using fear as a weapon, these became the bones of its new age. When the great empires of Europe began to rise, Spain, France, England, they did so with memories carved from the Mongol storm. The maps they drew, the wars they waged, even the colonies they would one day claim across oceans, all carried the ghost of the riders who once taught the world that no fortress is truly safe and no empire eternal. The invincible had been destroyed, but their idea of power, of domination through precision, fear, and speed became immortal. History had consumed the conquerors only to wear their armor anew. And somewhere in the silence between centuries, one might still hear the faint echo of galloping hooves across frozen earth, a reminder that what we fear most never truly dies. It merely changes form. If this journey through the dark corridors of history gripped you, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles and help keep these forgotten echoes alive. Like this story if the past still stirs something within you, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because the Mongols may have fallen, but their shadow still rides through the memory of every empire that came after. Time moved on, empires rose and fell, but the story of the Mongols remained like a scar across civilization, faint but never forgotten. The chronicles of their fury became lessons for kings and warnings for conquerors. Every generation rediscovered them, trying to understand how something so vast could vanish so completely, and how even the mightiest thunder could fade into a whisper. The Mongols had once ruled from the Pacific to the gates of Vienna, their riders spanning a quarter of the world. Yet in the end, their fall was not written by armies or nations, but by the quiet forces that rule all things: hunger, cold, time, and the fragile thread of human pride. The same power that had united them became the weight that shattered them. The empire of eternal riders became dust beneath the very earth they had conquered. But their memory endured. In the East, their names were spoken with reverence, in the West, with dread. Historians still trace their routes, still find the remnants of camps buried beneath centuries of soil, still marvel at how such precision, discipline, and terror once belonged to mortal men. The Mongols had changed the architecture of war, the movement of trade, and the boundaries of the known world. And though their empire was gone, the echoes of its creation and its destruction shaped the centuries that followed. Europe, reborn from its own ashes, never forgot the lesson the horseman had carved into its soul: that no power is infinite and no terror lasts forever. The hunted can learn to hunt. The broken can learn to rise. And in that reversal, in that quiet defiance of fate, lies the haunting truth of how Europe finally destroyed the invincible Mongols. If this story has kept you watching till the end, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles to uncover more truths buried beneath centuries of silence. Like this video to help others find it, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because history never truly dies. It only waits for someone to listen again.